What if I told you that one of the world's most dangerous standoffs might not be unfolding on the battlefield, but through two completely opposite statements? One from Washington, the other from Tehran. And both cannot be true at the same time. Donald Trump stood before reporters and with complete confidence, he made a statement that immediately grabbed the world's attention. A deal with Iran is near. For millions of people watching, it sounded like the first sign that months of escalating tensions might finally be coming to an end. Maybe diplomacy was replacing missiles. Maybe another Middle East war could still be avoided. But then, only hours later, Iran responded. And instead of confirming Trump's statement, Iranian officials rejected the idea of direct talks, publicly saying there were no negotiations taking place. They described the situation very differently from the US account. Suddenly, the story changed. Not because another missile had been launched, not because another military base had been attacked, but because the world's two biggest players in this crisis were telling completely different stories. So who's telling the truth? Did Trump know something the world didn't? Was Iran hiding ongoing diplomacy? Or is this exactly how international negotiations are supposed to look? Because here's something most people never realize. Some of the most important diplomatic negotiations in modern history were denied publicly, even while they were quietly moving forward behind the scenes. And that raises an even bigger question. Is history repeating itself? Imagine you're sitting inside a room. No cameras, no reporters, no microphones. Outside, the world believes two countries are moving closer to another confrontation. Inside, a handful of officials discuss possibilities that could affect oil prices, military deployments, regional alliances, and perhaps the lives of millions of people. The public never sees those conversations. They only hear carefully chosen public statements. And that's exactly why today's story is so difficult to understand. Because diplomacy is often designed to be confusing. Sometimes governments speak loudly to strengthen their negotiating position. Sometimes they deny discussions, even while discussions continue through intermediaries. And sometimes public statements are aimed at domestic audiences just as much as foreign governments, which means the headline itself may not tell the whole story. Let's stop for a moment. Forget politics, forget headlines, forget social media. Ask yourself one simple question. If one side says, "We're close to a deal," and the other side says, "There are no talks," how can both statements exist at the same time? That question is the heart of this documentary. And before this video ends, we're going to answer it. Not with rumors, not with conspiracy theories, but by following the timeline, piece by piece, until the entire picture begins to make sense. But to understand today's contradiction, we have to go backwards. Not days, not weeks, but years. Because this story didn't begin with Trump's latest statement. It didn't even begin with the latest military escalation. Its roots stretch back through years of sanctions, nuclear negotiations, regional rivalries, proxy conflicts, and a relationship built almost entirely on distrust. Every new headline is connected to an older decision. Every diplomatic statement has a history behind it, and every crisis leaves behind unanswered questions. Questions that governments continue carrying into the next crisis. Here's what makes this moment different. This isn't simply about whether America and Iran are talking. It's about something much bigger. If diplomacy succeeds, the entire Middle East could enter a different phase. If diplomacy fails, the region could face another period of instability. And that's why governments far beyond Washington and Tehran are watching closely. Israel, Saudi Arabia, European allies, Russia, China. Every one of them has something to gain or something to lose, depending on what happens next. But there is one detail almost nobody is paying attention to. One detail that quietly explains why Trump's statement and Iran's denial may not actually contradict each other as much as they appear. We're not going to reveal that yet, because first we need to answer another question. Why would either side choose to send completely different messages to the world? And to answer that, we have to go back to where this chapter of the story really began. Every crisis has a beginning, but almost never the beginning people think. When Donald Trump stood before reporters and confidently declared that an Iran deal was near, most people assumed the story had just begun. But in reality, that sentence was only the latest chapter of a story that had been unfolding for decades. To understand today's headlines, we first need to understand one uncomfortable truth. The United States and Iran don't simply disagree. They've spent decades building one of the most complicated rivalries in modern geopolitics. And every president, every Iranian leader, every military confrontation has added another layer to that rivalry. So today's question isn't just, why is Trump saying a deal is near? The real question is, why is this rivalry so difficult to end? Let's rewind, not to last month, not even to last year. Let's go back to one of the biggest turning points. For years, the Iranian nuclear program has remained one of the world's most controversial security issues. Washington argues that Iran must never develop a nuclear weapon. Iran has repeatedly said that its nuclear program is for peaceful civilian purposes, while international inspectors and governments continue debating the scope and verification of those activities. That disagreement changed everything. Sanctions followed, diplomatic negotiations followed, then periods of hope, followed by periods of crisis. Every time a deal appeared close, something happened. Trust disappeared. New accusations emerged. The relationship became even more fragile. Then the Middle East itself began changing. Conflicts expanded. Regional alliances shifted. Proxy groups became more active. Israel's security concerns intensified. Oil markets became increasingly sensitive to every new development. And suddenly, the dispute between Washington and Tehran was no longer only about nuclear issues. It became about regional influence, military deterrence, shipping routes, missile capabilities, regional alliances, and the balance of power across the Middle East. The stakes became much higher. Then came another turning point. Military tensions increased. Both countries exchanged warnings. Regional military deployments grew. Every new announcement triggered another response. News channels began asking the same question again. Is another war about to begin? Financial markets reacted. Oil prices moved. Governments began preparing contingency plans. Military analysts started discussing possible scenarios. For a moment, it felt as if diplomacy had completely disappeared. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. History shows that some of the most serious negotiations begin at exactly the moment when tensions appear highest. Think about that. The louder the public rhetoric becomes, sometimes the quieter the real diplomacy becomes. Because governments don't always negotiate in front of cameras. Sometimes they communicate through allies. Sometimes through regional partners. Sometimes through messages delivered behind closed doors. And sometimes neither side wants to admit publicly that those conversations are happening. Because public politics and private diplomacy don't always move together. Now ask yourself another question. If you were negotiating with a rival, would you announce every conversation to the world? Probably not. Because negotiations involve leverage, timing, public opinion, political pressure, and national interests. Every public statement can change the negotiation itself. Which brings us back to Trump's statement. When he said a deal is near, was he describing formal negotiations? Or was he trying to create political momentum? We don't know, because governments rarely reveal every detail of ongoing diplomatic contacts. And that's exactly why Iran's response becomes so important. Because Tehran didn't simply disagree, it rejected the narrative entirely. No direct talks, no confirmation, no public acknowledgement. Two governments, two completely different messages, one global audience. At first it feels impossible. How can both sides describe the same situation so differently? But that's because we're looking at the story from the outside. Inside diplomacy, things work differently. Sometimes what a government says publicly isn't intended for the country sitting across the negotiating table. It's intended for its own citizens, its own parliament, its own allies, or even its own political opponents. And once you understand that, the contradiction begins to make much more sense. But not completely, because one enormous mystery still remains. If Iran says there are no talks, why did Trump sound so certain? Confidence like that usually comes from somewhere. A conversation, a signal, a diplomatic message, or information the public hasn't seen. We're not ready to answer that question yet, because before we can, we have to examine Trump's strategy itself. What exactly was he trying to achieve? And more importantly, who was he really speaking to? Because the answer may surprise you. Imagine you're sitting at a poker table. Everyone is watching your next move. Every smile, Every pause, every word could change the outcome of the game. Now replace the poker table with global diplomacy, because that's exactly where this story takes us. When Donald Trump declared, "A deal with Iran is near," many people immediately assumed he was speaking directly to Tehran. But what if Iran wasn't actually his primary audience? What if that statement was aimed at several different audiences all at the same time? Because in international politics, a single sentence can carry multiple messages. One for your allies, another for your rivals, and another for your own people. That's why understanding Trump's negotiating style is just as important as understanding Iran's response. Throughout his political career, Trump has often presented himself as someone who prefers maximum pressure combined with direct negotiation. His public messaging has frequently emphasized strength first, negotiation second. The idea behind that strategy is simple: increase pressure, create uncertainty, then offer diplomacy. Supporters argue that this approach creates leverage before negotiations. Critics argue it can also increase tensions and make trust more difficult. Either way, it has become one of the defining characteristics of Trump's foreign policy, and Iran knows that very well. Now think about the timing. Regional tensions remained high. Questions about future security, military deployments, and diplomacy were dominating international headlines. Then suddenly, Trump publicly says a deal may be close. Immediately, news organizations across the world began asking, what changed? Exactly the reaction a major diplomatic announcement is likely to create. But here's where things become even more interesting. Because Trump's statement didn't only reach Tehran, it also reached Jerusalem, Riyadh, Moscow, Brussels, Beijing. Every government involved in Middle East diplomacy was now trying to interpret the same message. Not just what did Trump say, but what did Trump mean? That's a huge difference. Diplomacy isn't only about words, it's about interpretation. One country hears reassurance, another hears pressure, a third hears opportunity, and sometimes they all hear something completely different, which means the statement itself becomes part of the negotiation, not just a description of it. Now let's flip the story. Imagine you're sitting inside Iran's leadership. You wake up. International headlines everywhere say Trump believes a deal is close. What do? Do you immediately confirm it? Maybe, but maybe not, because public confirmation creates political consequences. Inside every country, leaders also have domestic audiences, political supporters, opposition parties, military officials, regional partners. Every public statement must be carefully balanced, especially during periods of high tension. That's why diplomacy often has two different conversations: the public conversation and the private conversation. The public conversation is designed for headlines. The private conversation is designed for results. And confusing those two can completely change how a story is understood. Now another question appears. If Trump was trying to create momentum, why didn't Iran simply stay silent? Why issue such a firm denial? Because that decision may reveal something much bigger, something that goes far beyond diplomacy. It touches national pride, political leverage, regional influence, and the image every government wants to project. Remember, governments don't only negotiate with other governments. Sometimes they're negotiating with their own citizens. But here's the biggest mystery we've encountered so far. If both sides genuinely wanted diplomacy, why couldn't they even agree on whether diplomacy existed? That contradiction seems impossible until you discover how modern back-channel diplomacy actually works. And once you understand that, almost everything begins to make sense. What if I told you that some of history's most important negotiations officially never happened? It sounds impossible. How can governments negotiate without admitting they're negotiating? The answer is hidden inside one of the oldest traditions in international diplomacy. It's called back-channel diplomacy, and chances are you've heard the results of it without ever knowing it existed. Let's imagine something. Not a real meeting, just an example. Suppose country A wants to send a message to country B, but the relationship between them has become so toxic that a direct phone call would immediately become international headlines. So instead, country A doesn't call country B. It calls country C. Country C then speaks to country B. Country B sends another message back using the same route. No public announcement, no official confirmation, no dramatic press conference. Yet communication is happening, quietly, carefully, away from cameras. This isn't unusual. Throughout modern history, countries that publicly described each other as enemies have often continued communicating through trusted intermediaries. Because even during periods of crisis, misunderstandings can be dangerous. Sometimes simply keeping a line of communication open can reduce the risk of a much larger conflict. That's why diplomats often say, talking isn't the same thing as agreeing. And agreeing isn't the same thing as trusting. Now let's come back to our story. Donald Trump says a deal is getting closer. Iran says there are no talks. At first, those two statements completely contradict each other. But do they? Not necessarily, because they were answering two different questions. Trump could be referring to diplomatic contacts, indirect messages, or his assessment that progress is possible. Iran, meanwhile, may be referring specifically to direct official negotiations, which its officials have publicly denied. Those aren't always the same thing, and that's why wording matters so much in diplomacy. One sentence can completely change the meaning. Now here's something even more fascinating. Diplomacy isn't only about reaching agreements. Sometimes it's about protecting political positions. Imagine you're an Iranian leader. Publicly admitting direct negotiations could create political pressure at home. Now imagine you're an American president. Publicly expressing confidence may reassure allies, influence markets, or signal that diplomacy remains possible. Same situation, different political needs, different public messages. But here's where the mystery becomes even deeper. If both governments understand diplomacy so well, why create public confusion at all? Why not simply tell the truth? Because international negotiations rarely happen in a political vacuum. Every leader must consider military commanders, parliament, allies, opposition parties, regional partners, financial markets, and public opinion. One careless statement can completely reshape the negotiation. Sometimes saying less creates more flexibility. Sometimes denying talks actually protects the possibility of future talks. It sounds backwards, but diplomacy often works that way. Now ask yourself another question. If governments sometimes hide negotiations, how does the public know what's actually happening? The answer is that most of the time, we don't, until much later. Years after major agreements are signed, documents become public. Officials write memoirs, diplomats give interviews, historians piece together events, and only then does the full story begin to emerge. History usually explains itself long after history happens, which brings us back to the biggest contradiction in this documentary. Trump says a deal may be close. Iran says there are no direct talks. At first, it sounds like someone must be lying. But after understanding how diplomacy actually works, a completely different possibility begins to appear. Perhaps both governments were describing reality from completely different perspectives. But don't jump to conclusions yet, because we still haven't answered the biggest question of all. If diplomacy really was moving forward, who had the most to gain? And perhaps more importantly, who had the most to lose? Because that's where this story stops being just about America and Iran and becomes a story about Israel, Saudi Arabia, Russia, China, oil, global markets, and the future balance of power in the Middle East. And once those pieces come together, everything changes. Imagine you throw a single stone into the middle of a calm lake. At first, only one splash appears. But seconds later, waves begin spreading far beyond the place where the stone entered the water. International diplomacy works exactly the same way. When Donald Trump said, "A deal with Iran is near," many people thought the statement was only about two countries, the United States and Iran. But in reality, that single sentence sent political shockwaves across the entire world. Because if Washington and Tehran move closer to diplomacy, every major power must rethink its own strategy. Let's start with Israel. For years, Israel has viewed Iran's nuclear ambitions and regional influence as major security concerns. Israeli leaders have repeatedly argued that any agreement must prevent Iran from strengthening its military capabilities and regional network of allied groups. From Israel's perspective, this isn't simply about diplomacy. It's about long-term national security. That's why every American conversation with Tehran is watched carefully in Jerusalem. Every word, every signal, every change in policy, because one diplomatic breakthrough could completely reshape Israel's strategic calculations. Now let's move south. Saudi Arabia. For decades, Saudi Arabia and Iran have competed for influence across the Middle East. Sometimes politically, sometimes economically, sometimes through regional partnerships. Although relations between the two countries have improved compared with previous years, the rivalry hasn't disappeared. So naturally, if Washington changes its relationship with Tehran, Riyadh also has difficult decisions to make, because diplomacy doesn't happen in isolation. One agreement can change an entire region. Now let's travel thousands of kilometers away to Moscow. At first, Russia seems unrelated. Different war, different geography, different priorities, but appearances can be deceiving. Russia carefully watches every major American diplomatic move, not only because of Iran, but because global diplomacy is interconnected. If Washington reduces tensions in one region, it may gain greater flexibility in another. And every major power considers how those shifts affect its own strategic interests. Now another capital, Beijing. China has long balanced relations with both Iran and countries across the Gulf. Stable energy supplies, regional stability, and uninterrupted trade routes are all important to Beijing. Any major change in U.S.-Iran relations could influence China's economic and diplomatic calculations as well. Again, different country, same ripple effect. And then there's something that affects almost everyone watching this video: oil. Most people don't follow diplomacy. Most people don't study international relations. But almost everyone notices when fuel prices change. Every time tensions rise in the Persian Gulf, markets begin reacting. Traders ask one question: could energy supplies be disrupted? If diplomacy appears stronger, markets often become calmer. If military tensions increase, uncertainty grows. That's why one political statement can sometimes influence financial markets before a single policy has even changed. But here's something almost nobody thinks about. Every government we've discussed has its own interests. America, Iran, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Russia, China, Europe. None of them see the crisis in exactly the same way. Each government is solving a different puzzle. Each government is trying to protect different interests, which means a successful agreement for one country may create difficult questions for another. That's what makes modern diplomacy so incredibly complicated. It's never only about two countries, it's about everyone connected to them. Now let's come back to Trump's statement and Iran's denial. Earlier, it looked like a contradiction. Then it looked like diplomacy. Now a third possibility begins to appear. Maybe both governments were playing different strategic games at exactly the same time. One speaking to international audiences, the other speaking to domestic audiences, both trying to strengthen their own position before the next chapter begins. But there's still one mystery that we've deliberately avoided answering. In every negotiation, there is one question that matters more than all the others. Not what is each side saying, but what does each side actually want? Because once you understand the real objectives, every public statement starts making much more sense. And that's exactly where we're going next. Every negotiation begins with public statements, but it ends with private interests. Governments rarely negotiate simply because they want peace. They negotiate because they believe diplomacy can protect their interests better than continued confrontation. Which brings us to the most important question in this documentary. What does each side actually want? Because once you understand that, almost every headline starts making sense. Let's begin with Washington. For decades, every American administration has approached Iran differently. Some emphasize sanctions, some emphasize diplomacy, others combine both. But regardless of strategy, one objective has remained remarkably consistent: prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. At least officially, that has been one of the central goals of American policy for years. But that's only one layer of the story, because Washington also has to think about regional stability, protecting allies, freedom of navigation, energy markets, counterterrorism, and avoiding another large-scale military conflict in the Middle East. Those objectives don't always point in exactly the same direction. Sometimes increasing military pressure can strengthen diplomacy. Other times it can make diplomacy even harder. Finding that balance has become one of the biggest challenges facing American policymakers. Now let's look at Iran. What does Tehran want? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. End sanctions, protect national sovereignty, strengthen the economy. But once again, that's only the surface. Iranian leaders also want something much harder to measure: respect, recognition, security. From Tehran's perspective, foreign pressure has often been presented as an attempt to limit Iran's strategic independence. That doesn't mean everyone agrees with Iran's position, but understanding a government's perspective isn't the same as endorsing it. It's simply necessary to understand why negotiations become so complicated. Now let's return to one country we discussed earlier: Israel. If America reaches any understanding with Iran, Israeli leaders naturally ask one question: will this make Israel safer or less secure? That's why Israeli officials have consistently argued that any agreement must address the broader regional security picture, not only nuclear issues. Because from Israel's point of view, a diplomatic breakthrough must also reduce future security risks. Otherwise, the agreement may only delay a larger crisis. Now, another important player: Europe. European governments have often supported diplomatic solutions while also responding to security concerns. Why? Because Europe has a direct interest in regional stability, energy, trade, migration, security. Every new crisis in the Middle East eventually affects Europe too, which means European leaders often find themselves balancing diplomacy with deterrence, exactly the same challenge facing Washington. Now let's ask the question we've been avoiding since the beginning. If every side says it wants stability, why does instability continue? The answer may surprise you, because governments don't always define stability in the same way. For one country, stability means stronger military deterrence. For another, it means sanctions relief. For another, it means changing regional alliances. Same word, completely different meanings. And that's exactly why negotiations become so difficult. Everyone wants peace, but not everyone agrees on what peace should actually look like. Now think back to the very first question of this documentary. Trump says a deal is near. Iran says no talks. Earlier, those statements looked impossible to reconcile. Now, after understanding what every government is trying to achieve, they begin looking less like contradictions and more like negotiating positions, each side trying to strengthen its own leverage before revealing its next move. But here's where everything changes. We've spent this entire documentary talking about governments, presidents, prime ministers, diplomats, military planners. Now it's time to ask a completely different question. A question almost nobody asks. What happens if diplomacy fails? Because history shows that failed negotiations can sometimes become the beginning of something much bigger. And that's exactly where our story is heading next. History has a pattern. Wars rarely begin because one leader wakes up and decides to fight. More often, they begin because diplomacy slowly runs out of time. That's the uncomfortable reality facing the world today. Not just in Washington, not just in Tehran, but across the entire Middle East. Because every diplomatic window eventually closes. The only question is, has this one started closing already? Imagine standing at a crossroads. One road leads toward negotiations, the other leads towards more confrontation. Neither road guarantees success, but one mistake can make choosing the first road far more difficult. That's exactly why world leaders are watching every public statement so carefully. Every speech, every press conference, every military movement. Because none of them exist in isolation. They're all connected. Now let's think about what happens if diplomacy completely breaks down. Not tomorrow, not next week, but eventually. History tells us that when communication disappears, miscalculations become much more likely. One misunderstood military exercise, one missile launch interpreted incorrectly, one intelligence report, one political speech. Sometimes that's all it takes to push two rivals closer to direct confrontation. Not because either side planned a war, but because each side misunderstood the other. History is full of such moments, which is exactly why diplomats often insist that communication should continue even during periods of intense disagreement. Because talking reduces uncertainty. Silence often increases it. Now imagine another scenario. Diplomacy survives, not because the two sides suddenly become friends, but because both conclude that continued confrontation costs too much. That doesn't mean every disagreement disappears. It doesn't. It simply means the competition changes. Instead of missiles, negotiators compete over wording. Instead of military deployments, they debate verification mechanisms. Instead of public threats, they exchange proposals. The rivalry continues, but through different methods. And in international politics, that difference matters enormously. Now here's something many people overlook. When governments negotiate, they're not only trying to solve today's problems, they're trying to prevent tomorrow's. That's why some negotiations take months, others take years, and some never succeed. Because every agreement requires compromises, and compromises are politically difficult, especially when domestic audiences expect strength. No leader wants to appear weak, no government wants to look as though it gave away too much. Which explains something we've been asking since part 1. Why did Trump sound optimistic while Iran sounded dismissive? Because optimism and caution can both serve political purposes. Sometimes they're part of the negotiation itself. But here's where our documentary reaches its biggest turning point. For nearly an hour, we've been asking, who's telling the truth, Trump or Iran? Maybe we've been asking the wrong question. Because diplomacy isn't always about proving someone right or proving someone wrong. Sometimes it's about shaping perceptions, influencing expectations, creating leverage, and buying time. If that's true, then perhaps both governments were playing different parts in the same diplomatic process. Not saying the same thing, but not necessarily describing different realities either. Now take one last look at the headlines. One says, a deal is near. Another says, there are no talks. Earlier, those headlines looked impossible to reconcile. Now, after everything we've explored, they're beginning to tell a much more complicated story. A story about strategy, timing, politics, diplomacy, and power. But we're still missing one final piece. The piece that answers everything. Not just whether a deal is possible, but why this moment matters far beyond America and Iran. Because in the final chapter, we're going to connect every thread, close every loop, and answer the biggest question we asked at the very beginning. Was this really a contradiction, or was the world watching diplomacy unfold without realizing it? Sometimes history doesn't change because a treaty is signed. Sometimes history changes because two governments quietly decide that talking is better than fighting. For nearly an hour, we've followed every clue, every headline, every statement, every contradiction. And one question has remained with us from the very beginning. Who was telling the truth, Donald Trump or Iran? Now it's finally time to answer it. Let's go back to the first two headlines. Trump says, a deal with Iran is near. Iran responds, there are no direct talks. At first, it sounded impossible. Either one government was telling the truth or the other was. But after understanding how diplomacy actually works, the answer becomes far more complicated. Because those two statements may not have been answering the same question. Trump was expressing optimism that diplomacy could move forward. Iranian officials were publicly denying that direct negotiations were taking place. Those positions can exist at the same time, especially if communication is occurring indirectly or if each side is describing a different aspect of the situation. And that's exactly why diplomacy often confuses the public. Not because governments always lie, but because governments communicate for different reasons. Throughout this documentary, we followed the military story, the political story, the diplomatic story, the economic story. Now let's connect them all. America wants regional stability, security for its allies, and limits on Iran's nuclear program. Iran wants sanctions relief, economic recovery, and recognition of its sovereignty. Israel wants security, deterrence, and long-term guarantees against future threats. Europe wants stability, energy security, and trade. Russia and China watch every American diplomatic move, not because they're deciding the outcome, but because changes in one region can influence strategic choices elsewhere. Different goals, different priorities, one negotiation. Now remember something we asked nearly an hour ago. Why would Trump publicly say a deal was close if Iran was going to deny it? Perhaps because public optimism can become a negotiating tool. It can reassure allies, signal intent, or shape expectations. At the same time, Iran's denial may also serve domestic and regional political purposes. Those two approaches aren't necessarily compatible, but neither is unusual in international diplomacy. So did we discover a secret agreement? No. Did we prove that hidden negotiations were taking place? No. And that's important, because responsible analysis means recognizing the difference between what is confirmed, what is publicly disputed, and what remains uncertain. The evidence available today does not allow anyone to honestly claim that a final deal already exists. But it does show that diplomacy, even when confusing, often unfolds through signals, carefully chosen language, and public positioning. Which brings us to the biggest reveal of this entire documentary. The story was never really about whether Trump or Iran won the argument. The story was about how modern diplomacy actually works. A world where governments speak publicly while negotiating privately. Where one sentence can calm markets or raise tensions. Where silence can mean caution and confidence can become strategy. The headlines were only the surface. The real story was hidden underneath. Now let's answer our final question. Is an Iran deal actually near? The honest answer is nobody outside the negotiations can say with certainty. Public statements suggest very different views. Future developments, not today's headlines, will determine whether diplomacy gains momentum or stalls. That may not be the dramatic answer people expect, but it is the truthful one. And in geopolitics, truth is often more complicated than certainty. As this video comes to an end, one thing should now be clear. The next chapter will not be written by headlines. It will be written by decisions made behind closed doors. Some of those decisions may never become public. Others may shape the Middle East for years to come. Whether this moment becomes the beginning of a breakthrough or simply another missed opportunity is a question only history can answer. Until then, the world will continue watching. Not just the missiles, not just the speeches, but the quiet conversations that rarely make the front page. Because sometimes the loudest stories begin in the quietest rooms. This is Conflict Insider.